So good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for coming tonight. I'm delighted to see such a great crowd, some new faces, some people, of course, that I know as well. And you're here tonight to hear the story about the man who sank Titanic. So that's my great-grandfather, but he didn't really sink the Titanic, but his name's Robert Hichens, and he was at the helm of the Titanic when it crashed into the iceberg. But Robert Hichens, his story, it wasn't just about what happened in Titanic. Of course, he had a beginning bit and an end bit. So I hope you enjoy this evening. Thank you so much again for coming. And our story begins down in the southwest corner of the British Isles, down in Newlyn. So any of you, how well do you know Cornwall? Do you know Newlyn and Penzance, that sort of area? Hands up, who knows Newlyn and Penzance? Penzance. Beautiful down there, absolutely beautiful. And in 1882, Newlyn was actually the biggest fishing fleet in the whole country. And so it was very, very tough down there. Big families, lots of big families, and the Hichens were no exception. So there was Father Hichens, who was Philip, and he would go out on his mackerel drivers. I mean, they'd be fishing for pilchard, sardine or mackerel, and they'd start from Newlyn and then go all up the west coast of the British Isles, all the way up to Liverpool, up to Scotland, back down to Aberdeen, down to Whitby, Lowestoft, and all the way back down to Cornwall again. So it was an absolutely massive journey. And it was on one of these journeys that he stopped at Whitby, and he met a lady called Rebecca Ward in Whitby. And actually all the different fishing towns and at that time were very similar, you know, they're same sort of mentality. So they got on really, really well. They had a good union. And while they were up in Whitby, they had a son called Philip. But it was much too dangerous for him to come back down to Newlyn. So he stayed up in Whitby, and he was brought up by his grandparents and didn't come down until he was a teenager. So Philip and Rebecca, they came down by boat all the way down back to Newlyn and started their life down there and went on to have 10 children. So Robert Hichens, he was the next son, and he was the head of the family really after Philip. And it was really, really common. So a lot of the families down in Newlyn would have big families. And one of the main reasons for that was insurance policy, because, you know, the fishing was so dangerous, and they would very, very often lose sons, brothers, uncles, fathers. And very often it would be the mother who would be the head of the household. So Robert went out at 14 and began his life at sea. But, you know, just let's have a look at Newlyn and what it was like. I mean, the religion, they were very, very religious there. And it was called primitive Methodism. And I must say, I do like a Methodist sermon. I'm not a religious person, but I do enjoy it. And maybe that's partly my roots. But down in Newlyn, it was singing the hymns of the sea. You know, they were very superstitious people. And they all had nicknames. Robert had two cousins. One of them was called Joe Pasty. I wonder why he was called that. And then another one was called Walloper Down. And he wasn't quite such an abstainer, so it was a bit more of the old Walloper Down. And when I was researching actually down in Newlyn, I went to the history centre down there, and there was a guy putting together 80 nicknames and all the stories behind the nicknames. I'd love to have seen the book of all of that. And in fact, Robert was called Banjo Bob. But I don't know that he had a banjo, but his name was Banjo Bob. So around that time, there were problems in Newlyn, problems with the fishing down there. And because it was very religious, in Newlyn, they'd have their catch on a Friday, but then they couldn't go out to sea again until the Monday, because they would recognise the Sabbath. But then what would happen is the fishermen from Lowestoft, further up the coast, quite a long way, they would go out and fish, and then they'd take their fish to market on a Monday morning, and their fish would be much fresher, and they'd get a good price for it. And actually this kept going on and created a very, very tense and dangerous situation that became the Newlyn riots. And it was massive. I mean, they had pitched battles on Penzance down at the seafront, and there were gunships coming in, and it was a really big problem. Now, I don't have evidence as such, but Robert Hichens, being 14 years old, you know, if you've got kids, any of you got kids, you can imagine that at 14 years old, Robert Hichens would have seen what was going on there. So about the same time, the fishing stocks started to become depleted. I mean, they'd done really well, and they'd have the pilchards in these barrels called hogsheads, and they'll sell them and put them on the trains up to London to the restaurants, or they'd sell them over and export them over to Italy. But the fish stocks just started going down, like they have done with us with the cod, and it became such a problem that posters started arriving around Newlyn, inviting fishermen, young lads, to either go over to America or, you know, Australia, to the New World, either to go mining or any other jobs, you know, over far, far away, or to join the Royal Naval Reserves. And that's what Robert Hichens did. So in 1900, he was about 18 years old at this point, 18, 19 years old. He left his family and went to start his career with the Royal Naval Reserves. And he had an incredible career. You know, he started off just as an ordinary seaman, and he worked his way up to leading seaman and then to quartermaster. He was working on the pre-dreadnought ships, which were the Sovereign class, and they had sails and combine engines as well. So they were neither fish nor fowl. He was on HMS Revenge and HMS Alexandra. And then he was sailing on these beautiful steam yachts. I don't know if you've ever seen old photographs of these really long, slim, beautiful sailed steam yachts. And this is where he became quartermaster. And of course, the main thing that he was doing was sailing them. He was at the helm. So he had 7 years experience. And actually something quite funny happened. Coming up to the anniversary in 2012, my best friend phoned me up, Fiona, and she phoned me up, she goes, "Hey, Sally, guess what's happened? There's stuff coming on the newspaper, on the news this morning, and there's this woman called Lady Louise Patton, and she's going to go on Channel 4 News and say that Robert Hichens, he spun the wheel the wrong way, and that's why he hit the iceberg." I thought, he's blim well not. So I was in the playground at the time, so I rushed home and I got changed and I went hot-footing it up. I was calling, "Is that Channel 4 News? I'm on my way. I've got to have a chat with this Lady Louise Patton." So there was me there. I met John Snow up there. It was lovely, John Snow. He's a lovely man. And I've got Lady Louise Patton sat next to me, and I'm there in my dress, and she's being all posh. And she's telling this story that Robert Hichens steered the ship the wrong way. And I let her do her bit, dig our hole deeper and deeper, because I'd just written a book about it, and I'd spent a whole year writing a book about a man who was steering the Titanic. So it wouldn't have been very good if I'd missed out that little bit. So nevertheless, I said my piece. I won. All the forums, the Titanic forums, said that, you know, it was the right story. She didn't have a clue, and so that was absolutely brilliant. Sorry, that's just a little sideline there. So Robert he's in Torquay, he's around Torquay, and he's on shore leave, and he meets this beautiful farm labourer's daughter called Florence Mortimer, and falls in love immediately, and they love each other very much. And they make quite an interesting couple, actually, because Robert Hichens, he's got short, dark, curly hair, steely blue eyes, and he's 5'6". Okay, and my uncle and my dad and my 3 uncles and my dad all look like Robert Hichens, and we've all got any doctors in the house today? Any doctors? What's that thing between your nose and your lip? Philprin, something like that. It's the long bit there. Well, we've got very long ones like Robert Hichens. Okay, so you've got Robert Hichens, 5'6", and Florence Mortimer, who's about 6 inches taller than him. So they make quite an interesting couple as they're promenading down on the seafront. So they got married, they bought a little flat in Torquay, and not long after they had their first daughter called Edna, and then a year later they had their next daughter called Frances. And it was at this time that Robert decided, look, I've got to do better than this. I've got to build my career, and I've got to go to where the big ships are. I need to be on the liners, you know, I need to be on those big steamships. And the nearest port to Torquay was Southampton. So in 1906, he took his family and off they went to Southampton. And Southampton was an incredible place. It was called a town. It didn't become a city until 1966. And it was huge. It was all in this huge, great big grid system of terraced houses, because Southampton just kept growing and growing and growing, and it doubled in size because it had hundreds and thousands of people who were all there for the ships. They're all there for the ships. So you're talking about linen, you're talking about building the ships, the firemen, the engineers, the boots, and all the different crew involved with all the ships. So Robert Hichens just got stuck in. They had a terrace house in the St Mary's area of Southampton, and Robert Hichens started sailing, getting berths on these big liners. He'd go on a troop ship, take troops over to India. He'd be up in St Petersburg and Norway. So he'd been up in the North Atlantic. He'd seen ice before. And don't forget, in 1903 was the Boer War. So there were lots of troops going backwards and forwards to India. So Robert just continued and continued as a quartermaster to build his experience. And we're getting to 1911 now. And 1911 was a very difficult year for two reasons. The first reason was that they had the worst drought ever, worse than what we had last year. Everything was new after the Industrial Revolution. There was tarmac on the ground, or the equivalent of tarmac on the ground. All was melting. The cars had just started, and the cars were getting stuck in the tarmac. The trains, forget leaves on the lines. The trains were buckling all over the place. There were real problems. There was no grass, so the cows had nothing to eat, so there was no milk. And the worst thing about it was, with no rain, the sewage systems. Can you imagine, with all those hundreds and thousands of people living in these little terraced houses, no rain to wash away the sewage. So it was absolutely unbearable. And on top of that were the coal strikes, terrible, terrible coal strikes. And without coal, there's no ships, nothing happening at all. So, they were very, very worried because Titanic was on its way over from Belfast. The Olympic was doing the run from New York to Southampton. But a lot of liners were having to go back to their ports, or they were stuck up in dry dock. And as Titanic came down to Southampton, and Robert Hichens was going to make sure he was going to get a berth on that ship, all the other ships were on dry dock. So while Titanic was moored up at berth 44, they pirated the coal from the other ships for Titanic, so that she had just enough coal to get over to New York. So we're getting towards the sailing day, and it's the 5th of April, and Robert Hichens goes down on Good Friday to dress the ship in all the beautiful flags. You saw the picture on Facebook, and that's such an iconic picture of Titanic. So you had the artists painting beautiful pictures, you had photographers there, and everyone was going to see this amazing ship. The paint was hardly even dry, and Robert got about 5 shillings as a scratch crew down there, finding his way all around the ship, looking at the gangplanks, finding out where he was going to be. It must have been so exciting, and his family were absolutely proud as punch with their son that was going to be taking the maiden voyage of this unsinkable ship. So on the 6th, which was the Saturday, thank goodness the coal strike lifted. So hundreds and hundreds of crew went down to the signing on offices, and Robert Hichens was there at the front with another 6 quartermasters. And after the officers, Robert was just the second person to write his crew details. And one of the things when I was researching the book was I went to Kew, to the records offices in Kew, and I had my white gloves on, and I was looking at the crew particulars. I was looking at letters that had been written about Robert Hichens' last days on Earth, and just the most incredible history about the Titanic and the crew, and it's very, very emotional and really, really special. So Robert's got his berth. That's 2 weeks' work. He's going to earn lots of money. It's going to take a week to get over to New York and a week to come back, and it's Wednesday the 10th. Florence, she's 6 months pregnant with my grandmother, Phyllis May, and she would be known as the Titanic baby. And so it's just all hustle and bustle. The trains are coming down, the first class trains are coming down from Waterloo, bringing first and second class passengers. Everyone's dressed in their finery, the crew, there's 900 crew, all looking absolutely amazing. And everyone just getting ready. Now, on the Wednesday the 10th, which was the signing on day, there's a band going on next door, so that's quite interesting. So on the signing on day, Titanic was due to go at 12 o'clock, and during the 100-year anniversary, I went to the memorial, and we were invited to go outside, and I actually heard the whistles over Southampton water, which was an incredible experience to hear Titanic's whistles. So Titanic's ready to go. It's midday, and they fire up the boilers. The coal's going in, and the huge, great big bronze propellers start to go round. And the displacement of water at berth 44 was absolutely incredible. So you've got the New York and the Oceanic on the other side to berth 44, and lots of people on those ships to get a better view of Titanic. And then as Titanic starts making her way from berth 44 to go down into the Southampton water, the water, the displacement starts bringing the New York and pulling on her ropes until eventually they snap, and the rope flings itself across the jetty and hits this woman, and she goes flying to the floor and was injured really, really badly. Everybody's jostled around and they jump off the New York. But the New York, this ocean liner, starts drifting towards the Titanic. So yeah, I know, it's amazing. So this little tug called the Vulcan suddenly gets in between the Titanic and the New York, and if they had collided, it would be matchwood, and it absolutely would. So the captain was incredible. They got a rope over the New York, tried to pull her away, but it was impossible. The second rope they just about managed, so they pulled the New York away from Titanic, but the New York was 4 feet away from Titanic, from the White Star Line's Pride and Joy. And I mean, can you imagine what would have happened? There would be no, history might be very different if she wasn't able to sail at that point. But she was. So off she went down to Southampton water and took the difficult manoeuvre around Calshot Spit, and then made her way over to Cherbourg. And Cherbourg, if any of you've been on a cruise before or understand about these big cruise liners, they can't get into harbour, so they're moored outside harbour, and a tender will go in and get the passengers. That's what normally happens, as is the case with Titanic. But it's at Cherbourg that the really big rich people are coming. So you've got the Guggenheims, you've got the Astors, you've got the Strauss couple, and very, very rich Americans, because this is the Edwardian era. It's the nemesis. It's the 1% of the richest elite, and then the rest are all the poor. That sounds familiar. And it was just an important time in Edwardian history. And all the rich people would just travel around the world on the trains and the liners. Marconi had started, and they'd either be in Africa blasting elephants and buffalo, to death, or they'd be going to visit people in various countries around Europe. So on they get to Titanic, and then she sets sail over to Queenstown, which is now called Cobb, or is it the other way around? Cobb, and it's now called it's Cove, and it's Cove now, and it was Queenstown in 1912. And it's here that they're picking up all the the emigrants, the people that are going to go over, the Irish going over to America. But even more importantly than that, they're going to pick up the mail, because Titanic was RMS Titanic. She was a Royal Mail Steamer Titanic. So on the film Titanic, of course, it's at that point that Captain Smith turns around to Murdoch and says, take her out to sea, Murdoch. And so off they go for this 7-day journey. Now, the weather conditions were favourable. It was calm. It was going to be a really lovely sailing trip over to New York. But during this time, there were lots of messages coming in from all different areas talking about the ice. It had been a particularly warm winter, and in Greenland, ice was carving off the side of Greenland as icebergs and starting to travel down on the Labrador currents. And so, there were ships stuck in field ice, people going back, ships going back to their port of calls, because it was a real problem. But messages weren't getting through. Some messages were getting through, but the Titanic should have realised that this was going to be a really big problem. But anyway, they don't know about this. They've got the rich and the famous on Titanic, and they just want to get to New York. So just a little bit about it. You've seen the film, either Waterlord or James Cameron's film, and the luxury. But just to remind you, you've got this fantastic gym with a mechanical camel and rowing machines and running machines. There's a squash court. There's a fantastic swimming pool that's right in the middle, around by second class, which was heated, and it was heated hot water, heated salt water, absolutely beautiful. There were sort of tennis lessons and people playing games outside as well. And of course, one of the things that they love to do is the passengers love to promenade all the way around the ship. And this was made easier because Bruce Ismay had ordered, he was the White Star guy, he had ordered the designer of Titanic, Thomas Andrews, to take a third of the lifeboats away. So that's a good idea, isn't it? Great idea to make more room for people to promenade around the whole length of the Titanic. So you've got smoking rooms, you've got the Café de Paris, you have the beautiful band, wonderful food, lovely sleeping accommodation, everyone's really, really happy. So down in the depths you've got the Black Gang, they're the firemen, there's 200 of them, the firemen, and they're busy filling the boilers with the coal, all the coal that's needed to get them over there. And actually, just as a point of interest, when Titanic came over from Belfast, there was a rather excitable fire blazing in the bowels of the Titanic, and this happens quite a lot actually, where the coal just spontaneously combusts. So you can't just put the fire out, you have to play water on it, and just, there's a particular technique of putting it out very, very slowly, which is what they did. And actually it didn't go out until the Saturday completely, but it weakened the right-hand side, the starboard side of Titanic. And some people say that had, something to do with what was eventually going to happen. But, conjecture, lots of ideas about what was going to happen. So let's fast forward. We're going to fast forward to Sunday the 14th of April, and it's Robert Hichens' time to go on shift. So you've got 6 quartermasters, but there's 4 of the quartermasters out on deck tonight. It's very, very cold. They're coming up, towards Newfoundland really, and the ship's going at 22.5 knots, which is almost her full speed. But they're not trying to win the blue ribbon or anything like that. They can go that fast because they can. Captain Smith is at this incredible dinner because this is his last voyage. He'd been with the White Star Line for 30 years and sailing for 40 years. So he'd been at this big dinner, this big feast, and he was going to go to bed now. There were hardly any officers around at all. In fact, none in the wheelhouse where Robert Hichens was. And people were sort of getting ready for bed. And just tell you a little bit about what Robert Hichens was doing. So he came on duty at 8 o'clock, and his mate was at the wheel at this point. And Robert Hichens' job was to take messages for the crew and to check air and water temperatures. So he went outside, and he could feel the cold. You could smell ice. It was freezing cold. In fact, over 3 hours, the temperature had come down 10 degrees already. He'd been up at St. Petersburg and Norway, so it was freezing, freezing cold. And so he went outside, and he should have had a fathom-long leather rope with a big leather scoop. And they throw it over the ship and take the water and then take the temperature. But that was missing. So instead he had a long piece of string, a paint tin can, and he had to use that. And actually the night before, a witness had seen a crewman just get the paint tin can and go over to a tap and fill it up and take that water temperature. But Robert Hichens was very conscientious and he wasn't going to do that. So he got his water temperature, it was about 1 degree, put it into his logbook, tested the air temperature, went back in. He'd done some messages around the ship, and it was now 10 o'clock, so it was time for him to take over. So it's, please excuse the Chinese dragon outside, which is very beautiful, and it just adds to the whole atmosphere. It's building excitement, isn't it? So thank you very much over there. So Robert Hichens, he's at the wheel, and he describes actually later on in the inquiry that it was like being packed in ice. You've got blinds going down. You can't let a chink of light out into the outer bridge because the officers wouldn't be able to see, and that would be really, really important. And he's got his course board in front of him. It's got a clinometer which tells about tilt. Obviously the course where he's going and how fast he's going, and it's just lit by a little candle, and that's it. That's all he needs to do. He needs to concentrate on what he's doing within the wheelhouse. And then in front of the bridge, just in front of that, and 50, 60 feet up in the air, of course, is the crow's nest. And up there, you've got 40-year-old Reginald Lee and 21-year-old Frederick Fleet. And it's freezing cold up there. Can you imagine, being up there? There's no moon, millions of stars, perfectly calm, and they're looking. And what do you think they're looking for when they're up there 50 feet up? What are they going to be looking for?
They're looking for icebergs.
They're looking for icebergs, and they're looking for other ships. And what are they looking at the icebergs with? What piece of equipment would they have?
Binoculars.
Is that right? Is that right at the back? Binoculars. And did they have binoculars up there in the crow's nest?
Probably not.
Oh no, they did not. And this is because when they were in Southampton, there was another second officer that should have been sailing with them, but he got bumped down so that Charles Lightoller could become the second officer, and he had the key for the binocular cupboard. So he went off, and so there were no binoculars for the crows, for the guys up in the crow's nest. Now, if you've got binoculars, you would still have to see with your naked eye first before you would put the binoculars up. But there were 6 officers down below. Don't you think that one of them could have just said, "Oi mate, here you go," and chucked their binoculars up? But that wasn't to happen. So on that night, Frederick and Reginald were looking for icebergs, and Robert Hichens was down in the he was in the wheelhouse. Now this is evidence that I have, and it's what I've written in my book, and I say very, very clearly that, you know, it is up to the reader and it's up to my audience to decide what they think happened on Titanic. But with my evidence that I have, this is what I believe happened. So it's just after 11 o'clock, it's about 11:15. Robert Hichens is in the wheelhouse on his own. The guys in the chart room are not there, they're doing something somewhere else in the ship. Captain Smith is in his cabin. There should be the first officer out on the outer bridge, but only him. But so this is what happened next. Okay, are you ready? Because it's going to get exciting.
We're ready.
Now, just to let you know, this is very exciting because at the inquiry, Robert Hichens' testimony is what happens on the James Cameron film and the Waterlord film. Most of it is his testimony, and it's what happens next. So it's about 11:15. Robert's on his own in the wheelhouse, and all of a sudden he hears one bell. He hears one bell from the crow's nest. Thinks that's really odd. What's that? And normally one bell is you see something on. It's either one side or the other side. You're hearing something. So anyway, he thinks, well, nobody's responding to that, so I'm just going to keep at my wheel. This is what I've got to do. This is my duty. And a few minutes later, he hears 2 bells, and then the phone rings behind him. And he's thinking, my God, this is very, very worrying, very, very concerning. What on earth is happening? Nobody's doing anything. There's no response from the outer bridge. Nobody's coming. No officers are coming. And Robert is getting really, really scared now. And it gets to 11:40, and all of a sudden there are 3 loud gongs from the crow's nest, and that can only mean one thing. All of a sudden, Officer Moody comes running down the back. The phone rings again. He picks it up. He says, "What is it? What can you see?" Oh my God! And then all of a sudden, William Murdoch, the officer, comes running in. Where the hell has he been up till now? And in a Scottish accent, he says to Robert, "Hard a starboard." And this is the iconic phrase that is in the history books. This is famous. This is my great-grandfather, Robert Hichens. Here's the order, hard a starboard. So he's got his feet there. He spins the wheel as hard as he can to the left. Now, starboard is right and port is left. But in this time, in 1912, the starboard, it relates to the tiller. So it doesn't change until 1933. So he's trying to avoid the iceberg that is bearing down on the ship. So he spins the wheel as hard as he can to the left, hard a starboard, and then William Murdoch says, hard a port. So what they're doing is a desperate attempt to go round the iceberg. This is a 46,000 ton, luxury liner. It's not a speedboat. It's not just going to whip round. There's lots of, people saying, oh, it would have taken 37 seconds. It would have taken this amount of time. But there was no way. The ship was going at 22.5 knots. It was going straight forward. They'd already seen icebergs before. Titanic just crashed into an iceberg. And we don't even know really how high it was, but it could have been a big growler. And a big growler, it's got a small amount on the top, but it still could have been it was above the boat deck, so people said. So it was about 80 to 100 feet tall, but it's all underneath, isn't it? It's the cargo underneath of the iceberg. And Titanic caught on her right-hand side, her starboard side, and it gashed. A 300-foot gash all the way along the right-hand side. And that gash, it just letting in water over one bulkhead and another bulkhead and another bulkhead. So at this point, I mean, it was incredible, really. You know, you would imagine hitting an iceberg and having that sort of impact, that everybody would be falling out of their beds and there'd be terrible things happening, China clattering everywhere, and it didn't happen like that. People described it like ripping calico, which is like a thick material, or going over 1,000 marbles, or like the ship coming into anchor. But people weren't falling out of their beds. But if Titanic had hit the iceberg straight on, a number of firemen would have been killed underneath, but Titanic would have been afloat long enough for other ships to come and save her. And that is, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that. So the captain comes in, he hears that, I hard a starboarded, we tried to port round her, but it was too quick and we hit. So Captain Smith says, right, call for Thomas Andrews, I need to get a damage report. So Bruce Ismay turns up, Thomas Andrews turns up, and Thomas Andrews goes off to do a damage report for 45 minutes. 45 minutes. What could have been done in 45 minutes? Knocking on the doors, get your life jackets on. So much could have happened in that 45 minutes. I mean, what do? You leave the wheelhouse, the steps are just next door, you go down the stairs, you say, oh, there's a blimmin' hole down there, right? You might come upstairs, you say to Captain Smith, there's a hole in the ship. And that's what's going to take 5 minutes. So anyway, it was terrible. Now, this is the thing. To be a fly on the wall in that wheelhouse. What did Robert Hichens hear? What did he hear from the officers, from Bruce Ismay, from Thomas Andrews, from Captain Smith? This is where the story was constructed, the whitewashing, the story that would have to go back, because they knew that within 2 hours, Titanic was going to sink. She was going to sink, she was going to flounder. And this is where Robert Hichens was going to get the story. This is where he was going to get the sanitised version of a story that he would later go on to 2 inquiries to tell. It wasn't necessarily his story, but it was the story. And this is a story that we know today. Anyway, so Robert Hichens, he's at his wheel until about 12:25, and then he's sent off. He's sent off to go to a lifeboat, and he's sent off to lifeboat 6, which is on the port side, the left-hand side, and the second boat to leave. And Captain Smith and Charles Lightoller gave him direct instructions, because they had seen a ship about 5 miles off in the distance on the port side, and they could see the lights. And they said to Robert, right, Robert, you've got to get the passengers down, row to the ship, get them off, and then come back and get more passengers. And that was the direct order Robert had. Now, for 100 years, Robert had the most terrible reputation as a bully and a coward. A coward for not going back for survivors, a bully for his behaviour in the lifeboat. But he was just doing his duty. He listened to what the captain and the second officer said. They started getting the ropes. There were 22 passengers in the lifeboat. Now, this is incredible, because in Belfast, they had 65 men tested in each lifeboat. But in the story, the tragedy, they were going out half full. In fact, one of them went out with only 12. 4 of the lifeboats just floundered and weren't working at all. It was an absolute shambles. It was chaotic. Lots of the lifeboats didn't have compasses. They didn't have blankets, water or biscuits, lights, all the things that you would need in your lifeboats. It was terrible. And the other thing is that being on the port side, and the fact that the rip was on the starboard side, the ship was already listing quite significantly. And so trying to get the lifeboats to go down, they were stuck to the side of the ship. So, it was awful. The ship kept sticking. And can you imagine these poor people? They didn't want to go down into the freezing North Atlantic in the middle of the night from an unsinkable ship at, 1:45 in the morning, leaving their husbands and, their sons on deck. It was absolutely terrible situation, but they had to go. It was women and children first, not women and children only, but women and children first. And they went and they got down to the water, and Robert Hichens said, everybody take an oar, women and all. There was even a little Pomeranian dog, and there was a stowaway with a broken arm, and an Iranian chap who was in the bowels of the lifeboat, and there were 22 on the lifeboat. So off they went, and they rowed and rowed and rowed and rowed, and Robert was just saying, please, row, row. He was terrified, actually, because of what he had just witnessed. He had just been sailing, he'd been steering the Titanic. This is his livelihood gone. And what would people think of him having steered this ship? That would be everything over for him. So it's not surprising that he was a gibbering heap in the lifeboat. But people were in the lifeboat were saying he was a coward and he was flailing about and being a coward in the lifeboat. He wasn't. He was trying to have order and command the lifeboat and get them to safety. So they rowed and rowed for 3 hours on the freezing North Atlantic. Robert was at the tiller standing up. He had no life jacket, no hat, just a coat, and he was getting frostbite around his lips. And in 3 hours they came to a stop. The ship that they were trying to follow had gone over the horizon and disappeared, and they were stuck. So they rested on their oars and they looked back. And what a macabre scene they saw. The ship was completely lit. The engineers down in the bowels of the ship were keeping the electricity going for as long as they could. And then they would have seen the most incredible, awful, awful sight of the Titanic starting to upend and then gently start her final descent down almost 2.5 miles down to the bottom of the North Atlantic. What a terrible thing. All those engineers and electricians, many of the firemen, loads of people going down in a terrible tomb. And it was absolutely terrible. So the trauma that these poor people in all these lifeboats, in the 16 lifeboats would have seen would have been awful. But Robert Hichens' lifeboat was 3 hours. It was a mile away from Titanic. And so after a while they could hear this low, they could hear the shouts and the screaming of the people in the water, but only as a low murmuring because they were a mile away. But there were witnesses in the lifeboats that were the last to leave that were very close to Titanic, and they said it was like a goal being scored in a football stadium, with everybody shouting and screaming, because nobody drowned. It was hypothermia. Because the water was only 1 degree, they were dying of hypothermia, and it was just absolutely awful. So it was at this point that one of the passengers of lifeboat 6 was to make her debut, as far as Robert Hichens was concerned, and somebody who I do not like, I will go on record to say, and this was the unsinkable Molly Brown. She was on lifeboat 6. So if you've seen the James Cameron film, she was this big, brash American woman who had made loads of money, and, DiCaprio, she was all helping him and sort of shouting and everything else. She was quite a good depiction, Kathy Bates, I think, who played her. And she was quite good, but the real Molly Brown was horrible. She wore more furs on her than any animal. And she's a big woman, and she got up and she started sort of saying, hey, you over there, you got to turn the lifeboat round and you've got to go back for survivors. All those survivors, we can get them in the ship. You've got plenty of room, all this kind of thing. And Robert was saying, we haven't got a compass. The Titanic has sunk. We can't go back. There's no moon. We can't go back. Sit down. She, no, we've got to go back. And she started trying to climb over people and get to Robert Hichens. And there's a bit on the film, I don't know if you've ever seen this, the bit on the film, there's this tall, skinny Cockney guy stands up and says, if you don't shut that hole in your mouth, there'll be one less in this lifeboat. And do you remember what I was saying about Robert Hichens, 5'6", Cornish accent? Yeah. So it wasn't him, and the guy who said it was in lifeboat 8 actually. So sorry, James Cameron, but that wasn't quite right. But never mind. So anyway, Robert managed to get her to sit down, but they had a huge row, and of course that's Robert's reputation in shreds, because when they were to get back to New York, Molly Brown was to go to the New York Times and tell her story about Robert quivering like an aspen, and it's like he was preaching and a coward, and that he took all the blankets and drank all the whiskey, which was just not true. Somebody had a tiny little one of those little mini silver flasks and gave him a sip, and he had a half-wet blanket around him, But nevertheless, it was in different newspapers that Robert Hichens was a coward. So this was cemented for 100 years. So anyway, so that's what happened, and then the dawn came up, and the lifeboats were all around them, and they could see rockets coming from the Carpathia, the ship that was coming to save them. So they had to turn around and row all the way back again, another 3 hours on this freezing Atlantic. And they were the second lifeboat to get back to Carpathia, and they got back on. They only saw one body floating in the water, because all of the bodies just drifted off in the currents. And it wasn't until sort of a few days later that other liners came around the same area that they saw unfortunately, you know, these poor people who had died of hypothermia with their lifeboats on. And I'm sorry for the younger people in the audience, but I know you don't mind a little bit of sort of squeamish stuff, but it's terribly tragic as well. There was a lady, she was hugging a big St. Bernard dog. There was another woman who had her baby in her arms. There were some people on an ice floe, and there were, you know, the sun loungers, and were frozen to death. And so people were picking up the bodies much later on. It was incredibly sad. So they got back to New York, and the crew were treated terribly. They weren't given any money. They had the same clothes from the disaster. It was absolutely shocking how badly the crew were treated. And then they had to go through the inquiry for 3 weeks. And then eventually they came back to Britain, and then they went to the British Wreck Inquiry as well, had to do it all again. And Robert Hichens did an incredible job. He told the story as it should have been told. It was absolutely brilliant. So he came back, and the officers that did survive, of course, Captain Smith and Murdoch, you know, they died, so they weren't witnesses. But the other officers, they all kept their jobs apart from Harold Lowe, who went back to Wales. And what happened to Robert Hichens? Well, he ended up in South Africa. So why did he end up in South Africa? He was seen as a Jonah. He was one of the main witnesses. Now, just to let you know, the two Crow's Nest guys, Reginald Lee and Frederick Fleet, Reginald Lee was found dead in a seaman's mission a year later. He had drunk himself to death, or he had complications from a heart attack. He'd been thrown out of the Royal Navy 4 years before Titanic for being an alcoholic. Yeah, he managed to get onto Titanic, so he died. And then Frederick Fleet, in 1960, hanged himself in his garden. And there were other stories about people killing themselves. These were the key witnesses, though, you know, and they had to give evidence. They didn't know what the hell they were talking about at the inquiries. The whitewash brush came out. Everyone was telling different stories. But anyway, Robert ended up in South Africa, and I have evidence to believe that he was paid for his silence because of what he'd seen and heard in the wheelhouse. So he was in South Africa for a while. He did come back to Southampton and managed to carry on the family line, so to speak. And because he actually had 4 daughters and 2 sons all together. But he came back in 1914 because it was the outbreak of World War I. So he went to Portsmouth, and he was barracked on the HMS Victory. So he was actually barracked on there. And he was getting ready to mobilise for the First World War, but then he started having terrible symptoms. You know, his back was really bad. He was having terrible nightmares, flashbacks. He had no energy, awful exhaustion, and he was actually invalided out with neurasthenia. But he did go on to serve, and I didn't know about this until much later on. He did actually go on to serve in the First World War in France in the artillery unit. So I was really glad, because I knew he'd earned his British War Medal. So it's good to know that he had actually gone there. And then when he came back, he'd had enough of the liners and all that. He didn't want to be a quartermaster anymore as such. So with his family, the girls were now older, you know, after sort of 1914 and a bit sort of after that. They moved to Torquay. And what was quite interesting, actually, when Robert came back, he went to Newlyn, and their family said he actually looked quite wealthy. He was really dapper, he had a lovely suit, he was flashing the money around, you know, he had money. When they went to Torquay, Robert bought a pleasure boat, and his wife started up a boarding house, like a B&B. Where on earth did they get the money for that? So, was that from the White Star Line? We don't know, but it's, you know, it's something that I write about in the book, and, you know, you can read about that if you want. But anyway, they're there, and it went really well for about 2 to 3 years. And I actually spoke to a man who saw Robert in Newlyn in the pleasure boat. He'd gone all the way around the coast from Torquay in his pleasure boat. And this man was very old, and he contacted me and he said, I remember meeting Robert Hichens. He was the captain of a pleasure boat. It was so incredible to hear something so close. So, but then we get to the Great Depression in the, 1933. And Robert, what he'd done is he'd borrowed a lot of money as well, because a pleasure boat is a very expensive thing. He had money of his own. He got some money from a loan company, and he also got money from a man called Harry Henley. Now, Harry Henley was not a very nice character. He'd been thrown out of the boatyard for fighting and being really horrible. And Robert, not being terribly bright, had borrowed money off of him. And when the Depression came, nobody was going on holiday. They weren't going to the boarding houses. They weren't going on pleasure boats. And Robert had to sell his boat, but he didn't know whether to sell it back to the loan company. And Harry Henley started threatening Robert Hichens and his family and making their life hell. And it went on for quite a long time, over a period of time, to such an extent that Robert Hichens started drinking. The relationship with Florence started breaking down significantly. So Florence took the children back to Southampton. Robert lost his house. He became destitute. He was a drunk, and he started traipsing the country trying to find work. And when he was traipsing the country trying to find work, he would write these little notes saying, Robert Hichens, helmsman of the Titanic, the loss of 1,500 souls, and he'd sell them. And actually one came up for auction at Aldridge's, but it was £600, and I didn't have £600 at the time, so I couldn't afford to get it. But I photocopied it on a creamy sort of paper and put it in a frame. I don't tell people it's the real one, you know, I do say that. I'm just too honest. But it's really lovely to have that. And actually I sent that to a handwriting expert, a very famous handwriting expert who lives in around Twickenham area, and he did an incredible report about Robert Hichens, and it was spot on about his personality. It was absolutely incredible. So Robert made a bit of money from this, but really the only thing he wanted from that money was to buy a gun. He bought a little silver gun, and the reason he wanted a little silver gun was because he wanted to go back down to Torquay and kill Harry Henley and himself. He blamed Harry Henley for the predicament that he was in, that he'd lost everything. He'd lost his wife, he'd lost his family, he'd lost his house, he'd lost his business. This Harry Henley had to go. So Robert Hichens came back to Torquay, and he went to a couple of pubs and met these guys and had a drink with them. He was drinking whiskey, he was quite drunk, and he was saying to them, he'd got his gun out and he said, this is harder than a boxing glove, I'm going to kill that Harry Henley. And they'd say, don't give the hangman a job, don't be ridiculous, you can't do that. And Robert Hichens got on a taxi and he went to this place called Happaway Court, and at 6 Happaway Court was this house where there was a light on, and Robert knocked on the door, and he could see a figure coming to the door opened, and there was Harry Henley. There was this man who had ruined his life, or so Robert Hichens had said. He was mentally ill. Everything that had gone through, from the war, from Titanic, from the drink, from everything at all, it all happened at this, you know, and they'd come to this. So he says, what are you doing here, Bob? And Robert says, I'm on the ground, I want you to pick me up. And Harry Henley says, I'm not going to pick you up. I wouldn't pick you up if you were the last man on earth. And if you weren't so drunk, I'll beat you within an inch of your life. So Robert Hichens reaches into his pocket and he gets out the gun and he aims it at Harry Henley. Bang! And he shoots him. He shoots him down the side of his head, and blood starts coming out. He grazes him with the bullet down the side of his head, and he gets his gun again, and he shoots the gun again, and it hits the wall on the other side. And then Harry Henley punches Robert in his face, and Robert goes flying back into the courtyard. And Harry Henley holds the side of his head and goes running out and down to the police station. And Robert gets up and he starts going after Harry Henley to go down the hill. But he collapses on the ground. And he's like this, and he's really drunk, and he gets the gun and he goes, oh my God, I can't believe it. I didn't manage to do the one thing I wanted to do. I didn't manage to kill Harry Henley. So there's only one thing for it now. So he puts the gun to his head and he pulls the trigger. And he misses. And he hits the wall on the other side, and then he falls into a drunken stupor, unconscious. And the police come up and they grab him and they take him down to the cells. And he's in the cells for 2 weeks till eventually he's brought up before the judge, and Harry Henley's there with his bandage on his head. It's a graze on the side of his head. and he hears the testimonies. Now, this would have been a hanging offence, but because Robert Hichens had had such a good war record, and because of what happened with the Titanic, and he could see that he was so destitute, the judge had pity on him, actually. He didn't hang him, but he sent him to Parkhurst over on the Isle of Wight for 5 years. So off he went, and while he was there, one of the lads who was going out with one of his daughters came over to Parkhurst to ask for his hand in marriage of one of the daughters over at the prison. And eventually in 1937, Robert had patched things up with Florence, and she met him at the station in Southampton, and they made it up, and they went back to Southampton, and they lived together for 2 or 3 years. And I'd like to think that they had a good time. I know that Robert absolutely adored Florence anyway, but after 3 years she started getting headaches, and the headaches developed and they got worse and worse, and it turned out she had a brain tumour. And Robert, he was so upset about it. Friends, family members and neighbours all helped to nurse Florence, but eventually she went to the workhouse, which was a bit like a hospices we'd have today. And in 1940, in about March, May 1940, she died. And Robert was so upset. He couldn't stay in Southampton any longer. The boys were a bit older. Bob was one of the boys. He went off and he got his own place. And the youngest son, Freddie, went to go and live with my grandmother, Phyllis May. And Robert was to take his last trip. So he went off to Liverpool and he got onto a ship called the English Trader. And Robert became a third officer. So he made it from a quartermaster to a third officer, back, working on a ship, not being a quartermaster, but third officer. And this ship called the English Trader, it had a terrible crash years before, and it had sort of split in half, and they'd sort of sewn it back together again. So what had been a really good ship to sail on, all of a sudden became really seasick ship, and it was terrible. And it was stormy and terrible conditions on the way to Africa and South America, where they were dropping off the coal. There was another coal fire in the bowels of the ship, and Robert Hichens was getting bronchial, his heart was bad, he was mourning Florence, he wanted to be with her, but he worked really hard. Sometimes he had to go below deck, but he'd always come back on deck and do his job. So when they'd got rid of the coal and picked up grain from South America, they had to take the trip all the way back again, another 3-week journey, terrible stormy seas, until eventually they made it back. But on one sunny day, he was talking to a gunner up on the deck, because all these ships just got to backpedal a little bit, actually. So many of our young generation, and well, I'm not young, but, I did not realise how extraordinary the cargo ships were. These amazing ships during the Battle of the Atlantic, going backwards and forwards, bringing supplies back to the British Isles. It was incredible. You have to see if you see the Cruel Sea, or something like that, or Battle of the River Plate, you'll really understand about that. And so for that reason, Robert Hichens, I don't think he was a hero at all on the Titanic. He was doing his duty, but I do think he was a hero being part of the Battle of the Atlantic, because all these cargo ships, many of them didn't have any guns at all, but they had some good guns on the English Trader. And there was this guy called William Hickson, who was the main gunner on the English Trader. He was having a drink with Robert, and Robert said, "I'll never see England again." And William was saying, "Of course you will." And Robert said, "No, I won't see England again." So eventually they come back to Aberdeen, and they're moored outside Aberdeen. And Robert just gets more ill and more ill, until eventually one of the stewards comes into his room and just sees him sat up in bed, and he's died of heart failure. Of course, I'm the sentimental type, so I'm saying he died of a broken heart, of course. And there were these incredible letters from the captain and the chief steward about the witnessing, and everything that had happened to Robert. And for 100 years, nobody knew, none of the researchers, no one knew what had happened to Robert Hichens. So 2 weeks before the anniversary, I couldn't have put it in my book, but I was desperate to know what happened to Robert Hichens. So I was phoning the records offices, I was phoning the council, everybody I could try to find out where Robert was. And at the last minute, after about 4 different calls to the council, I got a call from the council. We found him. And he was in Aberdeen, he was in Trinity Cemetery, So if ever you want to go and see Robert Hichens, he's at Trinity Cemetery up in Aberdeen, and you can find out from the council offices exactly where his grave is. And actually there's a gravestone, we are now in September 2019, and in about the next month there will be a gravestone for Robert Hichens. But there wasn't at this point. So I hot-footed in, I jumped on a plane and I went up to Aberdeen. I had a big wooden cross and I had 2 lots of flowers because Robert was buried with another seaman where he was in his grave. They're all TV and radio and newspapers up there, so I did all that business, and I looked at really lovely when I went up there, and it was all sunny and lovely, and I gave my interviews, but halfway through the interviews, all of a sudden all the clouds came over and it started being that sea rain, and I was plastered. I looked absolutely dreadful. But anyway, I don't mind. I had to tell my story because I'm so passionate about my story. So I had to tell my story, and eventually all these guys, they left and they went off, and it was just me and the grave, me and Robert. You know, he's down there, and he probably was down there. I don't think he ever made it up there. And he was there, and I just really, really hope that Robert was kind of smiling up at me, with a wry smile. It's a wonderful photograph of him smiling, and just thinking that maybe I was able to write this story that was a different story, that he was not a coward and a bully. He was just a quartermaster, taking orders, doing the best thing he could. He did serve in the First World War. You know, he did the best he could. He loved his wife. He was a good father to his children. And for me, anyway, I'm just really proud to be able to say I could tell the story about the last man at the wheel of the Titanic. So thank you very much.